of organized crime and tied it to drug trafficking in their different countries, mainly in Central America, Mexico expressed itself on the need to review different options so as to strengthen on a multinational focus the public policies aimed at fighting this scourge. We agreed in this sense to entrust the undertaking of a study both to the Organization of American States as well as to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime with the support of our governments and with whatever entities are deemed to be advisable, so as to undertake a technical, professional study that, based on solid and scientific evidence, will enable the strengthening from a comprehensive point of view our fight for the security of families, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. At the end of the day, it's a matter of undertaking a diagnosis and an analysis of all the alternatives that includes the implications, costs, and benefits of the different options of public policies that are possible that can be implemented on these topics. There was also a clear recognition with respect to the responsibility that we all have to continue to advance with determination in rebuilding and strengthening our security institutions and our law enforcement institution, including the great need to have law enforcement agencies and public ministries that are effective. Facing the criminals does not limit itself to drug trafficking, but continuing to apply social policies, etc., that have to do with doing away with extortion and anything related to this issue, and to continue to apply social policies, health care policies, education, and a generation of opportunities that benefit the most vulnerable communities affected by this insecurity. And as a result of this, Mexico has insisted on the need to generate new and more effective mechanisms of cooperation amongst all of the nations so as to face this scourge head on. We are leaving Cartagena with a renewed commitment based on the principle of shared responsibility. In particular, Mexico proposed, and the summit approved the creation of an inter-American system to fight organized crime. And I should tell you that there was a unanimous support for the proposal by the 33 participating nations at this summit. All of the heads of state and the government in the region have given instructions so that this system is integrated before the end of this year. And as the country that promoted the mechanism, Mexico will be the headquarters for the working sessions amongst the experts and those in charge of security and law enforcement in the continent. And the fruit of those deliberations will make up a continental network that articulates the policies and actions that will be put into place in this field. And in view of this decision, Mexico will promote the establishment of a center that will coordinate the full implementation of the hemispheric plan of action against transnational organized crime, harmonizing and coordinating the efforts on the topic in the different bodies of the region, in particular of the Organization of American States. The subject matter that was a part of the discussions of the summit was development and economic growth. And on Friday, I took part in the CEO Summit of the Americas, and for the first time, heads of state and government discussed with the business leaders of the continent on the best means of fostering prosperity in the region. And both at that forum, as well as in the working session of the Summit of the Americas, I expressed my firm conviction that the coordinates through which progress in this continent must go lay in integration, particularly economic integration, as well as in openness to trade and in freedom, and not in protectionism nor in nationalization of assets. If we want more economic growth, we must have more trade and more reciprocal investment, and investment that is internal in our region. Moreover, throughout my stay in Cartagena, I undertook several meetings of importance with other countries, for instance, as well as with other important personalities in the region. For instance, I had the opportunity to meet with the president of Walmart, Michael Duke, and he gave us the excellent item of news that Walmart in 2012 will be making investments for amounting to 20 billion pesos, basically in Mexico and in Central America, which we estimate can generate up to 23,000 new jobs in our country. This 20 billion peso investment from Walmart in Central America and Mexico basically is a very good piece of news for Mexico. I also met with other heads of state and government, for instance, with the heads of state and government of 10 Caribbean nations, to whom I ratified Mexico's commitment to convey the interests of the Caribbean nations on topics such as access to financing, food security, and support in terms of natural disasters and public security per se at the summit of the G20 that Mexico will be undertaking in Los Cabos in Baja California Sur. I also had informal meetings and conversations with several presidents and prime ministers in the region throughout the sessions. And I'm sure, my friends, that the results and the agreements attained in this international visit, clearly the new inter-American system against organized crime, and I must particularly emphasize the new policies to support our sister nation of Haiti in its efforts to have a better conditions, standard of living and living conditions to alleviate the suffering of its people, as well as positive work on Mexico's ties with all of the nations of the continent, and in particular with our most important trade partners and allies. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am at your disposal to take a few of your questions. I can see that no one is taking the floor. Luis Alberto Melo from Radio Centro. Mr. President, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. President. We'd like to know what the position of the Mexican government is in these discussions that took place in the summit on the topic of Cuba. The request of several countries that there not be another summit without the presence of Cuba. What is Mexico's position on these works, on what was expected of this work? And we'd also like to know if that position of Mexico is in any way conditioning some of the characteristics that Cuba will have to meet to attend these summits. And also with respect to this announcement of having the OAS undertake a study on drug trafficking to strengthen the fight. Mexico and Colombia and other nations are recognizing implicitly that these strategies have failed. First of all, I would say that Mexico has always had a policy of dialogue and inclusion with all nations, without any exceptions. And aside from regardless of the integration of the Summit of the Americas and the fact that it is very similar to the statutes and the charter of the OAS, I'd like to remind you, if I'm not wrong, that Mexico was the only country that was opposed to the exclusion of Cuba in the OAS, and this is a position that Mexico has ratified on an ongoing basis. Clearly, from there, we sustain a policy of inclusion of all Latin American and Caribbean nations without exception at all. This doesn't mean that we don't have different points of view, but also that we have a policy of full respect for the human rights and liberty and democracy in Mexico, Cuba, and in anywhere in the Americas and in the world. This is a position of myself and of my government, and that we will sustain, and it reflects discrepancies or differences vis-à-vis the circumstances and the political conditions that may prevail in Cuba versus other countries. But these differences are not an obstacle so that we can always express ourselves in favor of this inclusion. Now, vis-à-vis the position of those who feel that there should not be another summit without the attendance of Cuba, it seems to me that even under these circumstances, and if the necessary consensus is achieved for integration both in the OAS and at the summits, I feel that the results are valuable per se. The dialogue in and of itself that arises between the U.S. and Canada with other Latin American and Caribbean nations is a very valuable input for the understanding of our nations and for development itself. The contribution of the dialogue is invaluable and is this regardless of solving the consensus required to take one modality or another for the summits under the topic of Cuba or another. In other words, the dialogue is essential in and of itself. And I would say that in my experience, for a president of the United States to stay almost the entire time of the summit, to be sitting in the room and listening to all of the proposals and the opinions of all of the countries, be they very different or questionable or incompatible points of view. It seems to me that I think it was a very, very valuable gesture of President Obama that has to be taken into account. And it seems to me that that possibility of dialogue is one of the only possibilities for many countries that should not disappear nor be lost. In Mexico's case, by the way, we have many opportunities for this dialogue. I just met with President Obama a week or two ago in the summit of the leaders of North America, where Mexico meets with Canada and the United States. We've met on many occasions at the G20, in bilateral meetings, and in other summits called in other areas of the world. But for many countries of the Caribbean or Latin America, for instance, having a continental, hemispheric dialogue is an invaluable opportunity that, in my opinion, is clearly very important and needs to be maintained. Now, on the other hand, this in no way implies that there's been an indication of a flaw or failure of our strategy. Quite to the contrary, it implies the opportunity to strengthen it, to enrich it, and to commit, to bring in other countries to the work. I've said it in other fora, and I would take you to my speech in the United Nations Assembly General, where we indicated that the countries that are consumer countries had to take on a more shared responsibility in the fight for public security and the fight against organized crime undertaken by many countries, and that we are indeed calling upon that shared responsibility, and that consumer countries, clearly the United States, need to undertake a greater efforts to reduce consumption and, as a result, the extraordinary flow of financial resources that fall into the hands of the criminals. That it is the obligation of the consumer countries to establish and to explore all alternatives to reduce that flow of money, and that if it's not possible, or if it's not in their best interest or in their interest rather, to reduce the consumption of their citizens, then they must explore all the alternatives, including market alternatives, to reduce the flow that comes from the exorbitant earnings of drug trafficking and the consumption of drugs in the United States. I said that at that time, and I continue to maintain that opinion, and I will continue to maintain it. And this having to do with shared responsibility. responsibility and this search for alternatives that enable us to build a comprehensive policy that encompasses the supply and the demand of the market, that encompasses the fight against drug trafficking, but also organized crime and its violence, as well as the preventive measures and the axes that we've sustained, that although they're valid for Mexico, they're also valid for many other countries in the region. So fighting criminals head on, the rebuilding of the public security institutions and law enforcement institutions in our countries, as well as the reconstruction of the social fabric based on having more opportunities for jobs, health, education, and sports, etc., for Latin America and Mexico. They're valid for the entire region, and the undertaking of that study that we proposed and that we support will also enable us to improve and strengthen and having greater effectiveness and efficiency in our strategy, which has the common objective, which is not per se fighting drugs, but rather to have the security and the well-being of our families. Allow me to say that in Mexico, in Mérida, we undertook a summit of the Tuxtla dialogue and consultation mechanism where we dealt with the subject matter. It's a little long, but I would repeat some of it for the journalists, the international journalists who weren't aware of this meeting. We indicated at that time that consumption of drugs in the United States has generated a spiral of crime and violence in different countries of Latin America and the Caribbean due to the high economic power of their groups and the increase of their firepower. And more serious is the fact that the majority of the weapons used by criminals against civilians and authorities are acquired, purchased in the drug consumption centers without there being effective measures to fight this. And we also underscored that and sometimes the criminals don't limit their activities to the traffic and distribution of drugs, but they also diversify their activities and act as criminal activities that extort and kidnap people, and they seek for protection money in communities through threats to the citizens, etc. And on a sixth point, we also said, and I'd like to specifically refer to this, that in view of the foregoing and given the sustained evidence of the consumption of drugs, the heads of state maintained their conviction that it is indispensable that the United States of America and other consumer countries adopt more drastic and effective measures to track and cut the flows of monies that are the product of illegal activities to the criminal organizations. And doing this would take us to an incredible reduction in the demand for drugs. But if that's not possible in view of recent experience, then consumer countries need to explore all possible alternatives, and I would insist on this, all possible alternatives to eliminate the exorbitant earnings of the criminals, including regulatory or market alternatives oriented to this purpose. And that would include the idea of analyzing the fact that the movement of these substances have ended in a tremendous violence in the entire region. At the end of the day, there is a need to explore these alternatives, particularly by the consumer countries that generate the exorbitant amounts of monies to organized crime. We need to reduce those flows. The study that we have entrusted is a study of an analysis of alternatives, not to do anything but to strengthen and make the fight for the security of our families better and the fight against organized crime better. Ana Gomez Barra DF. Good afternoon. Mr. President, I wanted to know a little bit more about this inter-American system. You said that there will be a commission. Who would be on that commission? Well, basically, it would obviously have seats or be put together by all of the countries of the region, but it would basically be all of the countries that are fighting this international scourge of transnational organized crime, and we will be taking the first measures to organizing it. We, Mexico, are going to be creating the center, organizing the countries, creating the technical center, giving the support that's necessary, because we want this to work well. So this implies that all of the countries the 33 countries that take part in the summit and that signed the agreement take part in this summit, but the follow-up and the constitution of the center will be undertaken by Mexico to begin with. And I am sure that the meetings that we have in the future will enable us to having an increasingly specific and functional design as required in the future. Guillermo Cardoso, uno más uno. Mr. President, good afternoon. I'd like to ask you something that has to do with the previous question from my colleague. You went to Washington and you spoke to the reduction of the flow of weapons to our country. You've spoken of the role that the U.S. needs to take on to reduce the consumption of drugs. But we've also seen that things stay in pretty proposals and exchanges of information, of idea, and between you and President Obama. So I'd like to ask you, do you really have the intention, the objective, do you see that there is that objective and intention of the United States to reduce the consumption of drugs in the country and the flow of weapons to Mexico? And on the other hand, there are people who speak of 60,000 deaths in this fight against the crime in Mexico throughout the country. Does this generate any problem for you, as many people have indicated? To your conscience, that is to say? First of all, I would say that I am convinced that we are truly changing the discussion of this topic in a drastic way over the past 3 years. For an uncareful observer, it would seem that nothing's being done, but the actual fact that this summit debated the issue and that we reached an agreement means that there's been a radical change vis-a-vis a few months ago. We would not have been able to achieve this had we not permanently and clearly said that there was a shared responsibility of the United States on this topic. And now it's not just Mexico, but it's practically the entire region in Central America. Of course, the determined efforts of the Colombian government, and it's a topic that is on the table, and this generates results. Our strategy is not to depend on what the United States decides to do or says it's going to do. We require that shared responsibility, and today that principle of shared responsibility was clearly established, that all of the region has a shared responsibility. It's not just Mexico's responsibility. Secondly, I would say that the administration of the United States has undertaken efforts to reduce consumption, but I think it's not enough and it's not been sufficient. We need more. We need also to reduce consumption, but also the flow of monies. And in the case of weapons trafficking, clearly there are many interests that are opposed to regulation of weapons in this topic. To overcome these interests, we have to work in public opinion and in diplomacy so as to enable to look at it in that sense. And Mexico will insist upon that, to generate sufficient information in the world and in the region, and secondly, on pressure in the public opinion that leads to changes in public policy, in this case, in the United States. On the other hand, it's also worthwhile to observe what's going on in the entire region and to insist on, and I would insist on this, for the violence is not caused by the government. It's clear that the criminal groups, the organized crime in disputes, in battling for territories, not just in Mexico, but look at what's happening all over Latin America, or at least between the Andes and the consumer market in the United States, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Panama, here in Colombia, in Venezuela, in the Caribbean. Throughout all of the countries over the past 10 years or 15 years, we've seen a notable and dangerous increase in the violence and the number of homicides, to the extent that this is the most violent region in the world. And if in Mexico we consider including all of the problems that we have, the 18 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. Look at this problem within the perspective of countries in Honduras, where they have 70 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. Guatemala, more than 50 per 100,000. Jamaica, more than 40. Many countries in the Caribbean, higher figures. El Salvador, with very important problems in this sense. Here in Colombia, 34 per 100,000, almost double Mexico. Brazil, 23 murders per 100,000, more than Mexico. So it's not a problem of the government or just of Mexico. These are murders that are caused by criminals. It is absolutely absurd to say this in elegant terms, and it would be a limited vision to consider that these deaths are the result of the government's actions. These are murders that are committed by murderers who are basically and essentially attacking their adversaries in other criminal gangs or attacking society, and that is why the burden of challenge is to not fight the criminals, because if we leave them alone, it would be leaving the cause of a good deal of the problems that we face today. The action of Mexico's government is not generating violence. It's the violence that is demanding the action of the government, and the operations that has been implemented by the Mexican government do not come from what we've seen. Since there's violence, the local governments ask the federal government to intervene. The federal government intervenes, and then violence reduces. And that is the case of a great number of operations that we've implemented. The same applies in Tijuana, in Ciudad Juárez, in Acapulco, in Veracruz, in the Laguna, in Tamaulipas. And all of these cases attest to the fact that this confusion between cause and effect needs to be clarified. The violence is not a product of the work of the government. The action of the government is a clear and energetic response, but clearly to pre-existing violence. And in addition, it's as clear as this. Look at why this topic comes up. It's not because it's a problem of Mexico. It's a problem of the entire region. And there are countries that have different policies. There are countries that fight organized crime and others that don't. Some because they can't even do it. But the problem of murders and violence is a problem of the entire region. And clearly this reflects that the cause goes well beyond the action of the government. Finally, Pedro Mendoza from AP. Mr. President, good afternoon. First of all, my attention was drawn to the fact that you and President Santos spoke of President Obama's patience in listening to the 33 other heads of state and government. Well, you had to have seen him. Mr. President, what do you think of this summit? Was it a success? Was it a failure in view of topics such as Cuba, drug trafficking, and the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas Islands? I think that the summit was very well organized. It was impeccably done. Frankly put, if you put me in this situation, I don't think that life is black or white and that's the end of it. I think there's a lot of gray areas. And if you ask me if it was a success or failure, I'd say it was a success. And why? Well, because I think there was huge dialogue. Summits are meetings. They are encounters of heads of state and government, and of those encounters and meetings, we have a great deal of opinions and exchanges of information that are essential. We have no other opportunities to share ideas, and these summits enable us to do it. We have to share, we have to look and value at different mechanisms. For instance, I'm looking at the possibility of virtual summits for the COP16. We had many meetings through the internet, etc., and now for our allies in the Pacific Alliance, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico, I think we had the first virtual summit ever seen. We have a teleconference meetings from our respective offices. We looked at all of the trade issues that we're looking at, and I believe that that can be useful for the future. But I think that in this sense, the summit was a success. And by the way, although they might be the topics of the greatest interest for different sectors, they aren't the topics that are essential for the summit. The essential topic of the summit is how to be partners for our prosperity in the region, our joint prosperity and development in the region. And one of the ideas that I really liked from Alicia Bárcena's speech in the first day is how to face the challenges of development and equality. She said it in these terms. She said, it is a matter of growing to make societies equal, but also to make societies equal so as to grow. Those are the fundamental issues. The other topics may be of a great deal of interest for certain countries. Clearly, the issue of the Falklands or the Malvinas Islands are a clear priority for Argentina, but these are topics that are tackled and discussed. But the true issues of these that bring us to this summit and that are those that generate greater well-being for our peoples are those that have to do with development and our people. And I would insist that the development of our region has to do with freedom and trade. Insofar as we have greater trade, we will have a greater prosperity for our peoples. And insofar as we block trade between our regions, it'll take us longer to get out of underdevelopment. Thank you very much.